Okay. Deputy Connolly.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the commentaries, and I've read them. And just how many direct provisions centres are there? Am I correct in saying 36?
Yeah, in or around that, yes.
Why is it in or around?
Well, because it depends. Some people are housed in emergency accommodation, which is that facilities only take people who are asylum seekers and don't have any other function. But then at the moment, it's, my understanding is 37 is the current number.
Let me just, if you could give me, I understand, just to clarify some issues here. There are direct provision centres.
Yeah. Asylum
seekers are put into direct provision centres as a short-term solution. And we'll come back to the problems that have arisen. Those direct provision centres, we have two in Galway. One right opposite the station and one in Salthill.
Yeah.
That's 2 of 37, is
yes.
that correct? So 37. Then we have separately emergency accommodation in hotels.
In hotels, bed and breakfasts,
B&Bs.
guest houses and so on.
And that figure now is about 1,300, is it?
Our latest figure is in the region of 1,400 people are currently in emergency accommodation, yeah, and rising.
Okay. Then separately we have the EROCs, the emergency. Just what does that stand for again?
They are emergency reception orientation centres. They are for people whose status as refugees has been pre-approved and they are settled here through EU programmes.
Very good. So they're coming through the resettlement or the relocation programme,
yes.
where we give a commitment to take 4,000
yes.
people. And of those 4,000, we haven't taken 4,000 yet?
Not to my knowledge. I haven't the exact figure. We can get the figure for you as to where we are in that.
It's a little higher than that, but yeah, it's certainly not near 4,000 yet.
To our knowledge, yes.
Okay, so they have the status of refugees when they go into the RCOGs.
The EROCs, yes, they have.
EROCs.
Yeah.
EROCs, yeah. Okay, right. Now, I think the Ombudsman has been very clear in saying that what was short-term, and certainly I don't have a difficulty with direct provision for short-term. We have obligations and we have to receive people who are seeking asylum, and we must do it in a human way and a humanitarian way. The problem has arisen because the short-term provision has become long-term provision. Now, how long are we housing people, asylum seekers, in emergency accommodation? Has that already become long-term?
Well, again, to our knowledge, there would be people currently there who've been there 8 months, and that's rising because those people have not yet been relocated elsewhere. So there would be a number of people in emergency accommodation for 8 months.
Who are there for 8 months?
Yeah.
And then, in relation to the number of people who have actually got status as refugees and remain, I think the figure is around 700.
Well, our latest is in the region of 950.
950. So that's actually gone up as well.
Yeah, we can confirm these figures for you.
No, I'm not holding you to one or two little
Absolutely.
figures, but I was down at 700. There's a considerable difference between 700 and 900. 900, and you're saying 950 today, is it?
About 900 is the ballpark figure.
So, who have status,
yes,
but have no place to go.
Who remain in direct provision.
The main in direct provision, many of them for a very long time?
Again, we don't have status on how long people with papers are in direct provision centres. RIA would have
Who would have that? The Department of Justice.
Yeah.
So that would be significant to find out how long people have status and remain in there. Then separately, we have residents who are seeking asylum for longer than 7 years, isn't that right? Do you have figures on that?
Again, RIA would have those figures.
Yeah.
My understanding is it would be a very small number, but that there would be a number who would be there for a very long period of time.
I understand it was quite a percentage going back that were there for a very long time. If that has improved, that's good.
Mm. Well, again, the department would have those exact figures.
All right. Now, I welcome that you're saying there have been improvements. And I welcome those improvements. We've had the Mahin report and the many recommendations. Now, one of those recommendations, I think, was that there would be an independent monitoring body. Is that right?
Yes, but in practice, one of the recommendations was that my office should have jurisdiction over the centres, and that has been implemented along with the Children's Ombudsman.
So, in effect, you're the independent monitoring body that was recommended?
We're the only independent agency, along with the Children's Ombudsman, who regularly visits the centres.
Lovely. Now,
So we have, in practice, we have taken on that role.
Okay, and you're happy with that role and you have adequate resources?
We have adequate resources for the task we're undertaking at the moment. If somebody wanted a more detailed inspection regime, then that would be something we'd have to discuss, but at least we have feet on the ground and we are going to see the centres, and so we're in a position to report on our work to this committee.
Okay. Are there vacancies in your office?
There are constant vacancies in my office, mostly because my staff keep getting promoted to elsewhere in the civil service, which means we must be running an effective training agency. But nothing, no, that's not an issue for us.
That's not an issue?
No.
Okay. Then I think there was, we also, there was an EU directive, which is a mouthful somewhere. The EU directive, I can't remember the title of it. The European, that would be.
The EU Recast Receptions Directive.
Just say that slowly because it's a mouthful.
EU Recast Receptions Directive.
Okay, and then that became law in Ireland through regulation.
Yeah.
Okay, and what obligations have been put on the government in relation to that? That you're monitoring?
The obligations that people have a certain standard of care within the system. Mm-hmm. And that as well as part of that, there is a right of people who feel if they haven't got that standard of care, then there's a complaint mechanism for them if they are unhappy.
And I understand standards have finally been published, have they, in relation to under that?
Yes. Yes.
When were they published?
Yeah. We can get the department to confirm that at date of publication.
But that would be important for you as a body because you'll be monitoring. You're the independent
there would not
body.
be something we can look against. We can
you
check
haven't
people.
looked at those yet.
We haven't specifically checked people's experience against the standards because the standards are being rolled out on an incremental basis.
Okay. What explain that to me.
That they will be as centres contract are fulfilled and a contract falls for renewal. At that stage, a centre has to become compliant with the directive, which includes the standards. So as contracts expire on a rolling basis, the standards will be implemented on a rolling basis.
Okay. And in relation to those standards then, say in relation to, how many children in direct provision?
We would have those statistics. The
do you have them? Do you have them?
No, we don't keep those statistics.
Okay. Again, there's a substantial number of children in direct provision and a substantial number of children in emergency accommodation.
Yes.
Okay. And do those standards cover provisions for children? Does it cover basic things in direct provision centres like playgrounds and play facilities?
There are specific requirements on centres to provide communal areas, including play areas for children, as part of the new contract process, which is
as part of the new contract.
Yes.
So that's an improvement. Up to now, that wouldn't have been
Up to now, there were elements in contracts that required that, and they've been standardised in the standards and are now more formalised. But it is now an obligation for a centre to be able to demonstrate they have those facilities before a contract is renewed.
All new centres?
Yes.
And all centres getting a contract renewed?
Getting a contract renewed,
as well.
Yes.
Okay. And then in relation to a vulnerability assessment, I understand under that directive and the regulations that brought it into law that there's an obligation to carry out a vulnerability assessment on each asylum seeker within a specific period of time.
That's an obligation that would fall to the department rather than to the centres, yes.
Absolutely, but have you an obligation in that regard to monitor that, whether that's been carried out? Vulnerability?
As we move forward, we can look to instances where it hasn't been when we deal with complaints, but primarily we're dealing with issues raised with us by residents, which would include things like play facilities, which would include things like facilities for children generally. But we haven't had specific issues raised with us about vulnerability, to my knowledge.
About?
Vulnerability.
Well, I welcome the positive changes, and I come from Galway, and I'm fully aware of the controversy in Galway. I'm fully aware of a housing crisis as well. So if I have a chance, I might come back afterwards. I don't want to take other people's time. But the Department of Justice, every step of the way, has been forced to bring in changes. That's my opinion. I don't expect you to, but forced to bring in changes. And so here's something very important, a vulnerability assessment by law. So I'm wondering, your office is the independent monitoring body now for that. So As I understand, no vulnerability assessment has been carried out to date.
Well, that's something we'll take away from here in our meetings with Rio.
Very good, very good. Now, you talked about expansion, and my colleague here mentioned that you'd like to see your role expanded to cover the administrative side. Can you just tease that out a little bit for me, please?
Yes, certainly. The decision on asylum ultimately has to be a matter for the Minister, but the way in which it's administered is part of public administration in the same way that most of the activities that I deal with are part of public administration. Many of the complaints that come to my office are to do with delay in aspects of public administration, and usually we've been able to have an effective impact on that, sometimes just on individual cases by raising it with the department concerned and getting an immediate response for an individual, but also by looking at instances where it becomes obvious to us that there's systemic delay and engaging to look in detail at processes. So the kind of things we've done, just to give a sense of it, is that when we get individual complaints and it looks like there's a pattern, we will go to offices in different parts of the country and look at other files from people who haven't complained to us to establish whether that pattern has got a systemic cause, whether we're seeing variations. So the kind of things we've been able to address are variations in the way that individual offices and officers deal with processes which shouldn't be happening. There should be consistency, and also unnecessary delays, and by highlighting them sometimes. And to be honest, on occasions, departments and agencies are happy when we highlight the need for change, because it gives them the momentum to bring about that change or to find the resource they need in order to implement that change.
Yeah.
So.
And my colleague asked you when is that likely to happen or what progress has been made, and you've said you've been in contact.
No, this is a point that in response to the complaints we've been receiving and the issues about time people are being spending in direct provision, many people want to complain to my office about the process, but we have to tell them we can't deal with it. So as a consequence of that, we're now asking, and we raised that recently with the department.
Any idea when they're going to respond to you in relation to your request, the Department of Justice?
No, I think we'll have to engage formally with them now on that issue.
So your approach is to talk to them first, and then if there's no response, then there's a more formal engagement to see.
Yes, there's a process. In terms of extending my jurisdiction, it's a matter for Deeper or the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, but that will be on the recommendation of the Department of Justice.
It seemed to me it's a very important request, because the longer the delays go on, it's wrong for the asylum seekers in the first place. But also it's allowing a vacuum to develop where the most appalling attitudes are being expressed by a small number of people. So I think it's important that you are enabled and empowered so that the system is what it's supposed to be, which is a quick, efficient system to deal with applications for asylum.
Yes.
Short term. I have the report from the Controller and Auditor General. We're approaching 20 years, aren't we, of a direct provision system that was supposed to be temporary. And so when it's not temporary, and when there's minimum communication from a department, then a vacuum develops, which is extremely dangerous. That's my opinion. So what you're requesting is very important because, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, sorry. I just wanted to make the point. The Ombudsman offices across Europe are cooperating on the issue of asylum and immigration because it's become such a pressing issue and because it's an inter-country issue. So we've been looking to work together with colleagues and to gain some sense of what's happening. We have seen many other colleagues facing threats, their offices facing threats, because of their work in support of refugees and asylum seekers in their country. The issue of populism and the issue of the antipathy towards asylum seekers and immigrants is one that's affecting, I think, the whole of discourse, the whole of public discourse across Europe. It's not an Irish issue, as you well know. And I think it's very important, and I will lend my voice to this. I'm very reluctant normally to speak beyond the casebook, but the reality is that we as a country need to be properly providing for people who come to us as asylum seekers and as refugees. And as a country, we need to find ways of welcoming them and integrating them. And I think our work as an office will be directed towards dealing with them, the issues they're facing, and helping them to find their way to integrate into our communities. As somebody who lived abroad for many years myself, in a country that once was not very receptive to Irish immigrants, I think it really is incumbent upon us to make sure that we behave in the kind of way that we would have wanted to be, that we treat people in the way that we ourselves would have wanted to be treated when we lived and worked abroad.
I agree with you totally, Mr. Tindall. I agree with you totally, without any reluctance or hesitation. However, it is equally important to say that when a vacuum is created and when information isn't forthcoming to a local community, then comments are made by a small group of people. So there's a role for us as politicians, there's a role for your office, and there's certainly a role for the government and the department in relation to... Now, you talked about access to GPs, and I think PSSN numbers are...
Yes,
they were issues that were raised in a different way by the local community in Galway. I don't want to go parochial, but I want to talk just generally. Access to small... if the community... Actually, I'll repeat what was said, which is a very positive thing. They said we would give the shirt off our back to help refugees and asylum seekers. So I'd like to zone in on that as a challenge to the government and as a challenge to the department to build on that, what came out of Oughterard, leaving aside the other stuff, that they want to work and that they're open, but the manner in which it's been done is difficult. That's part of the problem in relation to communities that have lost essential services. Now, this is unusual. I'm going no further than that, but just to say that it would help if there was better communication, certainly.
I think from our perspective, the most asylum seekers went through Balseskin. Went through Balseskin, which was where they were initially assessed and where issues like their access to the Department of Social Protection were dealt with more and more people going into emergency accommodation. Some of those arrangements have been proving problematic. And so some of our work, we have been working with people in the emergency centres, and some of our work has focused particularly on that. And maybe Sean could, with your permission.
The normal process is that asylum seekers will go to the Balseskin Reception in North County Dublin, where they are initially screened, which, as Peter says, includes getting access to relevant services within the Department of Social Protection and the HSE, including a medical card and PPSN number, and optional health screening. With the increase in numbers seeking asylum and the need to recourse to emergency accommodation, a number of people have gone directly to emergency accommodation and have not had that initial screening, which means they arrive in the community without having access to GP services or medical card. As Peter says, we've been working with the HSE and the department to ensure that processes are put in place on the ground so that when people arrive in the community without those services, that in as short a period as possible, they get access to those services. The normal process is that they have pre-arranged access before people go to the community, but with a number of people going through emergency, that isn't happening at the moment in all cases.
And just directly related to the number of people in emergency, we have 950 in direct provision who shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
So
yes.
The numbers are astounding. One is nearly balancing the other.
Yes.
In terms of the increase in numbers, that goes up and down. I've looked at the graph over the last number of years. There have been different times where we've had more or less coming to the country.
Well, the last
so
2 years...
they're not huge numbers.
Well, the last 2 years in particular, it's increased up in the region of 50% compared to 2 years ago. So it has been
compared to 2 years
ago.
Yeah. And did you look back further and look at since the direct provision was brought in terms of the graph?
Well, it's because our remit was clarified with effect from April 2017, so we've been involved in it from then. I think
perhaps if you look at the graph, it's up and down from 2000. And finally, in relation to visits, are your visits unannounced?
No.
How many do you...
No, because
just how many are planned each year? And are you doing enough to get a good feel for it? Because certainly my experience of talking to people, generally in any institution, is they're absolutely afraid to complain. Any institution, not just direct provision.
Right. Yeah. Well, as regards our visits being on, no, we announce them because we want as many residents as possible to be aware that we're coming so we can speak to them. So that's the first thing, and we announce them for that purpose. As regards numbers, since our remit was clarified in April 2017. We visited all the centres. We've visited many of them a number of times. And what we've done this year with the emergency centres is, as soon as we become aware of where emergency centres are, we then try to organise visits. Sometimes we tie them in for logistical reasons with visits to nearby permanent direct provision centres. Your point on people expressing a fear of complaining has been made to us many times, but we would have to say, on the basis of what we have seen when we've gone to the centres, is we haven't seen any evidence of anybody being persecuted as a result of engaging with us.
Thank you.
All right. To Deputy Connolly, thank you very much.